Welcome back, warriors. Where war never ends, insanity never lasts. Don't forget to hit subscribe, turn on notifications, embrace yourselves. Because from here on out, there is only war. Let's go. There are many chapters of Space Marines in the Warhammer 40k galaxy. Each of them is unique in their own way, for better or worse. For better, you have the Blood Ravens. Heroism in the face of constant treachery and hardship, as well as rampant kleptomania, or the Lamenter's unflinching resolve in spite of the universe doing its best to step on them at every given opportunity. For worse, you have the Blood Angels, who, while quite noble and cultured, have a tendency to evolve into rage monsters every now and then, or the Space Wolves in general. The Viking Louters are worse in every regard. There is no better, but everything needs a default something to look at and recognize as being the average, the standard metric by which all others are compared to. And as far as Space Marines go, this would be the Ultramarines, not excelling at anything but good at everything. They're more or less the golden standard of the adeptosis. This has gotten them the reputation as Mary Sue's, which, to be fair, at least in the older days of Warhammer, was more than well deserved. I would say nowadays that it's waned away, though it will never fully be gone, built due to the past intense favoritism, and because some people are always going to complain that their favorite faction isn't the poster boy of the setting, so obviously the one that is just the worst thing ever. And Mary Sue tendencies aside, all Space Marines come from a source, their Primarch, the father of the Legion. And while the Ultramarines may in many ways be the average Space Marine, the vanilla ice cream of the Adeptacy starts, I propose that their Primarch is anything but. Roberta Gilman is my favorite Primarch, and indeed the one I consider to be the greatest of them all. While I don't think it's controversial anymore to say these become a pretty cool guy, saying he's the best might raise some disagreements. But let me tell you his story, and hopefully you too will see why Robot Guilty Spark truly is the brightest of the Emperor's sons, with the Emperor's foremost son as Lord Commander of the Imperium. A new hoax stirred. ROBOUTE Gilman is the Primarch of the Ultramarines chapter, Legion of Space Marines, and was the 8th one found by the Emperor of Mankind. Before that though, it's of importance to note that he was one of the only Primarchs to land on a world that wasn't a complete macro-ag, was more or less ancient Rome mixed with ancient Greece with better technology. It even had limited spacefaring capabilities, despite the Age of Strife making such things all but impossible for most other worlds. Now, oftentimes it wasn't exactly a nice place to live. They had the attitude of Spartans towards having children. If they're weak, off the cliff they go. If they aren't, it's time for military training at the ripe old age of 6. But you know, compared to planets like Chemos or Nuceria, I'd take a bit of child soldiering any day of the week. Bill's character, as well as grip strength when you have to fight your bunkmate to the death for the last scrap of roast boar. At least the continental crust of the planet was made of cardboard, like it was on Vulcan's homeworld. Gilman was found by Connor Gilman as a baby, who was an influential roller and all-around swell guy who pushed towards meritocratic reforms and generally making things nicer for everyone, unlike any other Primarch. However, he also had a mom, technically only Connor's center shoal, which is a fancy way of saying secretary, and in medieval speak, Tarash Utan would help raise her Bhutan, and the man who would become alongside Connor and into Eid. When faced with problems, Gilman would frequently think on her advice on how to handle the matter. Must have been one hell of a smarty pants if the son of a god was willing to bow to her advice on matters. As for Connor, however, he was a man trying to push for societal reform and a civilization that was essentially ancient Roman space. If you aren't sure why that's a bad sign for Connor's future, do some reading on the Gracchus brothers to see how the ancient Romans viewed societal reform. And sure enough, ROBOUTE was away on campaign against the people known as the Illyrians, because sometimes Games Workshop doesn't even try to hide their historical inspirations. Connor was slain by a treacherous ally, who was sick of all this talk of equality, fair governance, and not holding the position of Emperor for the highest bidder. Gilman lived at least, so that's something. As for ROBOUTE, he had originally planned to murder his father's killer, stone dead, and had the chance to do so, but there's a few things you gotta know about the man. 1. During his campaign against the Illyrians, Gilman came to realize that many of them were willing to surrender, and therefore he came to accept that diplomacy was just as valid a tactic as the Doomguy school of negotiating. 2. Gilman had always been intelligent. He was given command over the Illyrian campaign at the age of 12, after all, and with his massive brain power, he realized that if he killed Galen, his father's murderer, he would set a precedent for the future, and so he deferred to the Senate for Galen's fate. This shows that Gilman not only is able to keep control of himself in most situations, but most importantly, he's able to look towards the future when he decides upon a course of action. And you'd best believe I'll be coming back to that personality trait later in the video. As for Galen, the Senate decided that he would be ceremonially beheaded on a fancy rock, both another historical allusion to Rome and something that would become standard practice amongst the Ultramarines if they found any traitors in their ranks. Gilman himself had won the Senate over to his side and pushed his father's dream into fruition, turning the crag into a realm where you need to earn your place in life, not simply be born into it. When he was found by the Emperor, Gilman had been ruling for 5 years, and Nicaragua turned into quite the little empire, having annexed several systems purely through diplomatic means. It was on its way to acquiring many more. This would become the basis for the realm of Ultramar, as we know it in modern 40k. Once Gilman was put in command of his Ultramarines, the 13th Legion, and the one whose gene seed was derived from none other than himself, he went to work throughout the Great Crusade in a way that no other Primarch managed to equal. Using his brilliant mind, and perhaps most importantly, his willingness to actually talk to people, he achieved the highest number of compliant worlds among all the Primarchs. Though, to be fair, some other Primarchs had more military victories than he did. For all you fans of Primarchs like Gilman, Russell, and Angron, take note, you get a lot more done when your first contact protocol is saying hello. It's also possible that, upon seeing his immaculate jawline, many planets willingly join the Imperium for no other reason than that. Can't say I blame him. I mean, you could cut diamonds with this man's chin. On the topic of other Primarchs, unlike many of them, he had a damn fine head on his shoulders, though to be fair, he still had his flaws. He ensured the planets he brought to compliance were turned into model worlds for the Imperium, or at the very least that the taxes arrived on time. They had a standing army, so that things wouldn't just melt the moment the Ultramarines left the system. He wasn't like Angron, whose planets would surrender in favor of the World Eaters showing up and then be butchered anyways. Nor was he like some of the other lawyers' legions, such as the Space Wolves, whose barbarity, while at least in part a cultivated appearance, didn't exactly paint the Imperium in the best of lights. He was more than willing to listen to the counsel of others, though at times he was arrogant and thought his way was certainly the best way, unless shown otherwise. For instance, Ulfigan was not much of a fan of Gilliman, due to his dislike of the tactics Omegarius most favored, believing them to be rather dishonorable. To be entirely fair to Gilman, targeting civilian populations is exactly the nicest thing to do, but it did get results as far as the Great Crusade was concerned, and it was Chorus Corex who taught him many lessons about how irregular tactics in use of understrength units could still carry the day, which was something Gilman, with his Romanesque mindset of ranked formations and the like, had trouble adapting to. Nevertheless, despite any dislike he may have held for his brother's tactics, he respected all of them for their abilities, even if he felt they weren't something he should incorporate. He even had what he called his dauntless few brothers. He felt that fighting alongside them, he could win any war there was to fight. They were Leman, Russ, Ferrus, Manus, Rojuel Dor, and Sanguinius. And with that bit about Corvus being said, while Gilman may have had trouble coming up with novel ideas, once he found a way to incorporate something into his own tactics, he was going to find every conceivable way to improve and expand upon them. Basically, you can wrong-foot him once, but the next time you try and use the same trick, he's going to put you in the dirt. Corvus even admitted he could never beat Gilman in simulations. From that point forward, he might win a battle, but never the war. While many planets under his jurisdiction were still hellholes even after his restructuring of things, which funnily enough includes Nuceria, I propose there's reasons for this. For instance, in the specific case of Nuceria, I think it's likely he avoided digging around with it because it was Angron's home. And while Gilman was technically in charge of it, he probably didn't want to piss off his brother by screwing around with his home planet. Not that Angron probably would have given two shits, but what are you going to do about that? The other reason some planets weren't brought up to snuff 100% was that the products were required to maintain a certain tempo to their conquest in the Great Crusade, and properly restructuring every planet to turn into a new Macrad likely would have required time Gilman simply wasn't allowed to have. That's largely just me theory crafting, though, so don't take that as the word of God. That's the reason for it. And even beyond not being able to fix every planet up proper, Gilman still has a few black marks on his record. While he wasn't involved in the destruction of the 11th and 2nd Legions, Gilman almost certainly benefited from absorbing their numbers into his own, which likely helped him bring as many worlds into the Imperium as he did. He was also one of the Primarchs, the other being Roboulde, who came up with the idea that the memory of what the two missing ones did should be removed from the minds of the rest of the Primarchs, showing that, if nothing else, Gilman is about a little bit of Cloak and Dagger 1984 style. His most colossal up, however, is likely the time he helped the Emperor turn up the heat on the capital of Lord Oswald, Monarchia, by a few thousand degrees. When the Emperor came down on Lorgar for spreading the word that Biggie was a god, he chose the Ultramarines and Gilman to help him run it down, humiliated and forced to kneel before his creator and his brother. Lorgar would come to resent Gilman and the Emperor, planting the seeds of the Horus heresy. Gilman didn't hesitate in the slightest to do what the Emperor asked of him, but privately felt discomfort over it, and felt that it had a repairably damaging effect on relations between the two legions. Yeah, I don't think you need to be a genius savant to figure that one out, G-Man. Going forth, we enter the tremendous fun times of the Horus heresy. In Gilman's case, he was initially in the dark about Horus's treachery, and when Horus ordered Gilman to embark on a good old-fashioned orc cleanse alongside the word-bearers, he was happy to oblige. He felt it was a good opportunity to begin mending relations between the two legions, as well as himself and Lorgar. Unfortunately, it was too little, 40 years too late, and Lorgar had become corrupted by chaos. By this point on the planet of Kalfwa, what was intended to be a casual orc genocide turned into a bloodbath, as the word-bearers turned on them and began decimating the Ultramarines. Nearly half the Legion was destroyed, and Gilman himself was vented out into the vacuum of space without a helmet. For most people, this would have understandably guaranteed their death. Gilman decided that breathable atmosphere was for him, and began punching word-bearers so hard their heads exploded. After that, Corfair unstamped the Primarch with the chaos-corrupted blade, much like Horus was, in order to turn him to the traitor side as well. Gilman's response was to punch Corferin so hard his heart briefly stabbed the word-bearers were driven off, as despite their sudden betrayal, giving Gilman any amount of time to breathe and form strategy means you've already lost the battle. Things after this don't get any better for Gilman. However, Lorgar and Angron raised merry hell on the realm of Ultramar with air forces, and his Gilman was chasing them around, while a blanket of warp storms cut him off from the rest of the galaxy. He decided that if he couldn't confirm the Imperium was still standing, he would act on the assumption that it had fallen, and it was up to him to carry on its ideals. Thus, he created the Imperium Secunda, spoke to carry on the Imperium's torch, and to round off their own empire references with his very own Byzantine Empire macro-ag is even the perfect little Constantinople. Of course, what happens here could be a video all on its own, but I'm trying to keep the focus on Gilman. So to sum it up, he fought Angrons in Lorgar, while the form was being turned into a demon by the latter. Comrade Kurz ran wild across Macrod for a while and even reached his adopted mother, who was completely unfazed by his. The Lion and Seguinia showed up. They all argued a bit about what to do from this point going forward, and then, when Gilman realized that the Imperium was in fact still a thing, and Terra was under siege, she threw out the entire Byzantium business and helped the Blood Angels so they could reach Terra. While he never participated in the siege himself, he would do his best to head there without most speed. Indeed, the Ultramarines and Archangels gunning it for Terra to leave was part of the reason the siege played out the way it did. After Biddy was killed and Horus killed even harder, Gilman would help things going forward in the Imperium. He of course participated in the scouring, the driving off of all remaining traitorous studies to the Eye of Terror, and Games Workshop's next big project to avoid doing any work on the old world. He also penned the Codex Extartes, which divided all the legions into chapters as we know them now. Not all of his brothers were a fan of this, but eventually he got his way. One day he came into contact with Fulgrim, as the two fought Fulgrim nearly cut off his damn head. Fulgrim's sword was also poisoned because, of course, it was locked away into stasis so that he could never truly die. For 10,000 years his body was held in public display Lenin style, and eventually where he lay would become a site of holy pilgrimage. During this time the Imperium would become what we know it as today, the worst place you could ever possibly live. It was rumored that even in stasis as he was slowly but surely healing from his grievous wounds. But even with this, there he lay for millennia, comatose and doing nothing, as the Imperium fell apart around him. The 10,000 years later, Belisarius called him the Eldar, Fascinoma, fancy new suit of armor. Ubrain kissed his boo-boo so they would be all better, and he woke up. As he awoke, he realized he had a problem in the form of a horde of Chaos Space Marines surrounding him, quaking in fear and about to do their damnedest to make sure he was killed properly this time. In one corner we have hundreds of chaotically enhanced super soldiers blessed by the gods themselves, some of whom have no doubt been fighting for over 10,000 years, and may even remember when Gilman was put in his coffin. In the other corner we have someone who just woke up from the world's longest power nap, was probably a bit dazed and confused on account of sleeping off the world's most poisonous hangover, and didn't even have a damn weapon in his hand. The Chaos Marines never stood a chance because apparently, when Gilliam was asleep he did nothing but dream of One Punch Man for 10,000 years straight. He stood up, assessed the situation, and repeated his stunt on Calth by punching people to death until they eventually stopped showing up. This time he didn't have to contend to the lack of atmosphere, so you're going to be damn sure he was getting even harder now that he could actually breathe to once again speedrun his accomplishments. Fulgrim tried to tempt him into the service of Chaos, which, come on man, stop trying to do that to kill him and it isn't going to work. After it failed, Fulgrim said he'd never find satisfaction of anything ever again, which if anything, just ensures he's immune to slain issue corruption. Yet another common Fulgrim, Ellen Nurgle, tried to tempt him into staying on Ultramarmon by infecting the realm with the disease that could only be cured by being admitted to Gilman's presence. But Gilman saw that in the grand scheme of things, he could save more lives by getting out and doing stuff. So that didn't work either. He headed for Terra. He but was kidnapped by Kairos Fate Weaver, who bound him in chains made of Gilman's repressed emotions. Don't think about that too much. Skybro decided to try and break Gilman out so he could kill him himself, because all the Chaos gods just want to get onto the party, apparently, and the Harlequins LED cipher to him to help him break free with his head still attached in exchange for being allowed to see the biggie. He also cut off Scarborough's head during all of this, which is always a cool thing to see because corn demons can go back to the hell they crawled out of. He reached Terra via the Web Boy with Eldar help, only for a surprise, Madness and the Thousand Suns to have followed them, and now it's time for a battle on the surface of the moon. Magnus nearly had him dead to rights, and then the Custodes and Sisters of Silence showed up, and Magnus got shunted back to the Wark. He had Cypher arrested once he saw the sword that was on his back, which turned out not to work at all because it's Cypher. The man's more elusive than a politician being asked to give a straight answer. He talked to the biddy, he started reading Lorda's original holy book dedicated to him, and concluded that while Lorda probably had a few things right, the Emperor is not a god worth worshipping. He immediately began restructuring the Imperium, as he rightly found it to be incredible, and when the High Lord staged a coup on Terror against him, which as an aside is astoundingly treacherous and moronic, Gilman put his justice plan skills to the test and counter-couped them and killed everyone. Really, that's how that story ends. With any traitors now dealt with, he launched the Indominus Crusade to keep the Imperium from fully shattering in the wake of the Great Rift. Something I really like to emphasize is how Gilman managed to orchestrate something almost equal and scale to the Great Crusade all by himself and shorter time span. Goes to show how far up his own ass the Emperor's head is, if he had any doubts about that. The Plague Wars happened where Materion and Urgel decided they'd quite like to take a chunk of Ultramar for themselves, and Gilman once again found himself squaring off against a demon Primarch. Mortarion stabbed him with a needle filled with some super disease, the titular godlight of the novel Godlight, and it killed Gilman for real this time. Then the Emperor possessed Gilman's corpse, told Mortarion that he was Anne, but could still be saved, and Liturgals guarded on fire before resurrecting the Blueberry Wonder. You might say that's plot armor to the highest degree. To that I say that every single demon of chaos, as well as at least a few traitor marines, have the ability to resurrect themselves as well. It's not plot armor, it's evening the score. This is just the first time the Emperor has ever decided to actually get off his psychic gas and do something other than act as the galaxy's biggest lighthouse. As for a few miscellaneous things about him in the 42nd millennium, as I said, he's been reading the Lectitio divided tattoos and coming around to the idea that the Ecclesiarchy and Larger may be onto something. Though as I also said, he certainly doesn't think the Emperor is a god worth worshipping, given how big of an ass he is. He came to that conclusion after talking to the man. By the way, a space marine that was in his presence was so awed by him that he found he couldn't speak. And his peasants, he decided to go down to the workshop and cut out his own tongue. He's been having a hell of a time keeping the Imperium together and has been more than happy to do things previously unthinkable, such as work with the Eldar, and even play lip service to the Emperor's divinity. He outright told an Imperial priest that he considers the entire Ecclesiarchy the lesser of many, many, many evils. But he's smart enough to know that it's one of the only things keeping the Imperium together. He's also apparently been developing a goddamn harem between Yorvain and a rogue traitor who calls him Robo. How cute! Sleeping with him would probably be like trying to fit a semi-truck through a doorframe. But you can't blame a girl for shooting her shot, now can you? Now before we move on, I want to tell you why ROBOUTE Gilman is the best Primarch out of all of them. To keep in mind that these are, of course, all my humble opinions, because when you say something is the best, it's always going to be subjective, unless you're talking about something purely numbers-based. This next bit will probably be the most serious I've ever been in a video, because sometimes even I confide it in myself to have actual opinions on something without needing to punctuate it with a joke. ROBOUTE Gilman, for all his faults, all the times he could be called distant from others, actually cares about those under him, a quality that at any point in the Imperium is a rarity amongst the top leaders. While his strategic viewing of things means he's often detached from those around him, he will never put men to their deaths unless he firmly believes that is the only course of action that will win the day. He cares for those under his command, a superhuman warrior or not, and indeed to this day tries to imagine what his foster mother would do in a situation. Such was the value he could place on the word of mere mortals. He is, at heart, a good man, even if only by the standards of 40k, and while other Primarchs could also be said to be decent people, few of them put it into practice like Gilman did. It's one thing to lament, you left a planet in shambles. It's another thing to nut up and actually fix the thing. He's also quite possibly the only Primarch capable of even remotely bringing the Imperium back from the brink. War is well and good, and in 40k, you need to be capable of doing some fisticuffs to get anywhere in life. But only being good at war is something that only coordinate demons can get away with. And Gilman is the ultimate statesman. Bar none. Not even the Emperor himself can compare. In my opinion, you need to keep people fed and supplied. You need to make sure industrial centers are kept up and running. You need to make sure supply chains are kept up and running, so the people doing all the fighting can keep doing all the fighting. Gilliman knows all this. He knows this and knows how to optimize it so that everything is actually run well. Places he administers succeed because they actually perform well, not because they have infinite amounts of bodies. If they're at the problem, and eventually you'll drown the problem out in corpses, Gilman is perhaps the only Primarch capable of seeing the Imperium from its worst enemy itself. He's also one of the Primarchs who consider the ideals of the Imperium more important than the Emperor. In fact, he never considered the Emperor his father, only his creator. Quite frankly, he didn't like the Emperor, how he's holding against him, how he was forced to raise Monarch to the ground, even if only in private. As far as ROBOUTE take Herod, his father was Connor Gilliman, but he knew that while it certainly had flaws, the ideal of the united mankind is one to strive for in this mess of a galaxy, and he genuinely believed that he was one of the best suited to do this. While commanding the best legion around, you can call it arrogance, but I don't think it came from a place of I'm better just because I am. He could certainly be arrogant, but he generally felt he was the best man for the job in many cases, and while this one of many enemies amongst his brothers, he rarely, if ever, held it against them. In fact, Gilman also possesses a quality. Almost no one in this godforsaken setting has the ability to admit when he's wrong. When he was introduced to tactics he had never considered or even knew of, and was proven why they were effective, he would immediately implement them into his own. You might need to beat it into his head a couple of times, but eventually he will come around. And when shown that what he is doing is objectively wrong, such as when it was revealed that the Imperium Secundus was unnecessary, he immediately cancelled the whole thing and gunned at it for Terra with L-speed when Singulinius made her through the traitor blockade around the crack. Despite his occasional arrogance, he has humility, or at least the common sense, to admit when he's wrong. Gilman also, in this, to my knowledge, is quite unique amongst the Primarchs, looks towards the future in a way that goes beyond just trying to make things better in the now, rather than whine about the past and be blinded by the present. He plans ahead. When Rogue Doran was busy banging his head against a brick wall, because Porto Rabo politely asked him to, when Lehman Russ was busy drowning his sorrows in Space Marine grade alcohol, Gilman acted knowing that just because the bad guys were gone, didn't mean everything was good to go. Now while Malkler is responsible for setting up much of the bureaucracy the Imperium has now, it was Gilman who helped ensure it could run at peak efficiency, and while the Imperium today is an utter waste of lives and resources, it says something about Guilliman's abilities that even after 10,000 years it's still running at all, even if only barely. As for the Codex Astartes, you can argue that it was a waste of using the Space Marines as a combative force, that they should have been kept together as legions to beat things to death. With that argument has merit, but even if you think he was entirely in the wrong with reorganizing the remaining Marines, you can't deny he was actually thinking ahead when he did so. He was trying to prevent something like the Horus Heresy from ever happening again. He was using his goddamn brain and trying to make things easier for the future. Maybe you think he succeeded, maybe you think he's an idiot. But he did something to prepare for the future rather than either wallow in the past or stew in the present. And yeah, I get that it's understanding about their Primarchs weren't thinking ahead like the Oracle of Delphi, or if someone stabbed one of my parents, I probably wouldn't be in the best state of mind either. But Gilman did his best to rise above and plan flood those approach. Mine might not have been, and the reason I think he's the best beyond all others is this. Gilman, unlike any other Primarch, failed while he was on his home planet, or rather, he believes that he failed, and had to come to terms with the fact that the world does not revolve around him. That he is not all-powerful, and that, with few exceptional circumstances, he and he alone is responsible for his own actions. And like I said, in my eyes that makes him better than any other Primarch. He watched his father die in his arms, and he held himself accountable for not being able to save him. He had come to terms with the fact that he was not good enough to prevent this tragedy, and grew as a person because of this. Most of the other Primarchs had no problem getting their way on their home planet, and this made it so that none of them had to come to realize what we all do. That can and will go wrong no matter how hard you try, and you just have to accept that in life. Even those that did fail found it easy to blame their failure on an outside source. The Emperor and Automatarian both resented the Emperor for coming in to save them at the last minute. They found him to be a convenient source to pin all their anger on rather than looking at themselves. Gilman never had this. He met the Emperor years after his father died, and in fact I firmly believe that this makes Gilman uniquely situated for being able to carry on the Imperium. Other Primarchs certainly had it worse than him. I mean, Conrad Kurz exited his capsule pod inside a pool of magma, for God's sake. But Gilman is perhaps the only one who early on had to come to terms with the fact that the universe can just on you, and thus I firmly believe that he's not only incorruptible, but will carry on fighting as long as he can without ever succumbing to despair. Before we end the video, how about a do or don't for using Gilliman? I gave him a gas one after all, and I guess technically Gotrick as well, even though it was like a minute long, because he's got Trick goddamn Gurnison. I should state that this will be for 40k and not 30k, because I do not care for the Horus Heresy. For lore positives, Guilliman is the man in charge of the Imperium, so if you want the ultimate personification of a commander leading from the front, you can't do any better than him. If you like Space Marines, well, he's the father about of all the loyalist chapters in the galaxy, since Ultramarine gene seed is the most commonly used, so it's hard to do better than him in that case. If you like the Imperium being about as close to lawful good as it can be, you'll also want to grab Gilman. And if you like the idea of your soldiers being led by divinity, you can't do much better than one of God's sons. Also badass bureaucrats, mostly an oxymoron in the real world, but very much in place here. Also, look at his model. I know JW has had problems with way over designing their models and see the Adeptus Mechanicus, but given that he's both the son of the Emperor and currently the only loyalist Primarch available, I think it's fine here. Absolutely stunning, and his face isn't too dopey either. For tabletop positives, Gilman hits like a truck. This is of course to be expected. Being a Primarch, and all his ranged weapon can shoot through weaker and even lightly armored infantry with ease, and can be good for at least shaving a few wounds off more heavily armored targets. Given that he also wields the Emperor's sword, he's pretty good in melee too, 6 attacks and AT, AP-4, and causing D3 mortal wounds on an unmodified wound roll of 6. It's going to put the hurt on most targets, firmer armored targets, without an invulnerable save. He can also just punch the out of them with his massive power fist, while only being AP3 compared to the sword's AP-4. It doubles his strength rating of 6 rather than only adding 2 like the sword does. He can also take a respectable amount of damage, rocking 9 wounds, a 2-up save, and a 3-up invulnerable save. Just ignore any towel railguns, and you should be fine for a while. Oh, and the first time he dies on a 4+, he comes back with D6 wounds, so you can kill him, and if he rolls well, he can come back almost in full health. That is one impressive middle finger to give your opponent. Of course, as I've hopefully driven across in this video, he's much more of a planner than a fighter, and that's why you really want him. He has to be your warloader if you pick him, and by doing so you get an extra 3 command points to dick around with. So even if he somehow gets tabled turn 1, you get some guaranteed benefits out of this man. Now get ready for all these buffs, because Gilman hands them out like candy. Any units with the Imperium keyword, not just Space Marines or Ultramarines, but the Imperium as a whole, can add 1 to advance and charge rolls within 12 inches of GUILLIMAN, re-roll hit rolls of 1 within 12 inches of GUILLIMAN, and re-roll morale tests within 12 inches of No Man. On top of that, Ultramarine core and character units can re-roll all hit rolls within 6 inches of them, and re-roll wound rolls of 1 within 6 inches of him as well. Finally, Ultramarine infantry and biker units can heroically intervene within 6 inches of them. He is going to make sure your army is running at peak performance, and it has no choice in the matter. As for the lower downsides of using Gilman as the role of the Imperium, he's not going to be participating in a battle if it isn't a major fight. He's got a galaxy-wide empire to run. He can't throw himself into every skirmish he comes across. So keep that in mind if you're a fan of smaller scale battles. Also, if you don't like Space Marines or Gilliman, you probably don't want to run Warren Gilman, the father of the Ultramarine Space Marine chapter. That should be obvious, but you never know. And of course, if Matt Ward is still giving you an Ultramarine hate boner after all these years, yeah, you're not gonna like Gilman. Moving on to his tabletop downsides, there's a couple worth considering. You can't put him in a transport, so he's gonna have to foot slog it across the table at movement in 8. This could be worse, but 8 inches isn't exactly breakneck speed, especially if you really want him to be somewhere specific. Also, unless I misread something, I don't think he can deep strike either, so yeah, he's got to just run it across the field the whole game. Honestly though, the worst thing about him isn't really anything with his stats or abilities. It's his point cost. Properly using him at 300 points, you are going to be hard-pressed to fill out a proper army in smaller games if you include Gilman, and in larger games if he goes down, you just lost a massive point investment that was probably also a keystone of your army. Additionally, his auras all require him to be relatively close to models. It means that you can't just keep him in the back line all game and farm easy kills. He's got to get to the thick of things sooner or later. And while he's certainly no slouch in combat, other armies have far better beat sticks and for less points. For instance, the avatar of Kane really shouldn't surprise you. That's who I'm bringing out to compare him to. Kenny Boy clocks in at 280 points, 20 points cheaper than ROBOUTE, while Kane doesn't buff his army nearly as well, but he can one-shot Titans. If you put Gilman in a fight with Kane, you are losing 300 points. You need to balance out a risk and reward with the Primarch, because while he's tough, he isn't invincible, and it'll be real damn embarrassing if your ultimate victory plan turns to smoke because Gilman tried to charge a crow, as a field, and a pair of Chaos Knights unsupported. He's incredibly strong, but you shouldn't use him as a beatstick. He's a general who can hold his own, but at the end of the day, that's probably your best bet for using him as a general who can hold his own, not as the end-all, be-all combat monster. That just about wraps up my talk in everyone's favorite Grandpa Smurf. I hope you will embrace Gilman's superiority alongside me now, or at least look at him in a bit of a different light. And that's it. You've survived yet another video of mine. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to drop a like, subscribe, and leave a comment to let me know what you think, or just rant about some filthy Xenos. That works too. Thank you of course to my channel members. You were the theoretical, practical meme to my ROBOUTE. Gilman, technically, you think my content is worth something, and practically, you give me money to help me keep making content. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. Yeah, I know it's an overplayed meme. I don't care. Eldor waifers are now canon. Suck my nuts. Give me more space, elf smut. Gas won after all, and I guess technically Guttrick as well, even though it was like a minute long, because he's got Trick, goddamn Gurnison. I should state that this will be for 40k and not 30k, because I do not care for the Horus Heresy for lore positives. Gilliman is the man in charge of the Imperium, so if you want the ultimate personification of a commander leading from the front, you can't do any better than him. If you like Space Marines, well, he's the father about of all the loyalist chapters in the galaxy, since Ultramarine Giant Seed is the most commonly used, so it's hard to do better than him. In that case, if you like the Imperium, being about as close to lawful good as it can be, you'll also want to grab Gilman. And if you like the idea of your soldiers being led by divinity, you can't do much better than one of God's sons, also badass bureaucrats. Mostly an oxymoron in the real world, but very much in place here. Also look at his model. I know GW has had problems with way over designing their models. See the Adeptus Mechanicus, but given that he's both the son of the Emperor and currently the only loyalist Primarch available, I think it's fine here, absolutely stunning. And his face isn't too derpy either for tabletop positives. Gilman hits like a truck. This is of course to be expected, being a Primarch. And all his ranged weapon can shoot through weaker and even lightly armored infantry with ease, and can be good for at least shaving a few wounds off more heavily armored targets, given that he also wields the Emperor's sword. He's pretty good in melee too. 6 attacks in AT AP, -4, and causing D3 mortal wounds on an unmodified wound roll of 6. It's gonna put the hurt on most targets. firmer armor targets without an invulnerable, so if he can also just punch the out of them with his massive power fist, while only being AP 3 compared to the sword's AP -4, it doubles his strength rating of 6, rather than only adding 2. Like the sword does, he can also take a respectable amount of damage, rocking 9 wounds, a 2-up save and a 3-up invulnerable save. Just ignore any towel railguns, and you should be fine, for a while. Aha, and the first time he dies on a 4+, he comes back with D6 wounds, so you can kill him. And if he rolls well, he can come back almost in full health. That is one impressive middle finger to give your opponent, of course. As I've hopefully driven across in this video, he's much more of a planner than a fighter. And that's why you really want him. He has to be your warloader. If you pick him, and by doing so you get an extra 3 command points to dick around with. So even if he somehow gets tabled turn 1, you get some guaranteed benefits out of this man. Now get ready for all these buffs, because Gilman hands them out like candy. Any units with the Imperium keyword, not just Space Marines or Ultramarines, but the Imperium as a whole can add 1 to advance and charge. Rolls within 12 inches of GUILLIMAN reroll, hit rolls of 1, within 12 inches of Garbanzo Man, and reroll morale tests within 12 inches of No Man. On top of that, Ultramarines core and character units can reroll all hit rolls within 6 inches of them, and reroll wound rolls of 1 within 6 inches of him as well. Finally, Ultramarines infantry and biker units can heroically intervene within 6 inches of them. He is going to make sure your army is running at peak performance, and it has no choice in the matter. As for the lower downsides of using Gilman as the role of the Imperium, he's not going to be participating in a battle if it isn't a major fight. He's got a galaxy-wide empire to run. He can't throw himself into every skirmish he comes across, so keep that in mind. If you're a fan of smaller scale battles, also if you know like Space Marines or Gilliman, you probably don't want to run Gilman, the father of the Ultramarine Space Marine chapter. That should be obvious, but you never know. And of course, if Matt Ward is still giving you an Ultramarine hate boner, after all these years, yeah, you're not gonna like Gilman moving on to his tabletop downsides. There's a couple worth considering. You can't put him in a transport, so he's gonna have to foot slot it across the table at movement 8. This could be worse, but 8 inches isn't exactly breakneck speed, especially if you really want him to be somewhere specific. Also, unless I'm misreading something, I don't think he can deep strike either, so yeah, he's got to just run it across the field the whole game. Honestly though, the worst thing about him isn't really anything with his stats or abilities. It's his point cost, and properly using him at 300 points, you're going to be hard-pressed to fill out a proper army in a smaller games if you include Gilman, and in larger games if he goes down you just lost a massive point investment that was probably also a keystone of your army. Additionally, his wars are requiring him to be relatively close to models. It means that you can't just keep him in the back line. Oh no, game him in, farm easy kills. He's got to get to the thick of things sooner or later. And while he's certainly no slouch in combat, other armies have far better beat sticks and for less points. For instance, the Avatar of Kane really shouldn't surprise you. That's who I'm bringing out to compare him to. Kenny Boy clocks in at 280 points, 20 points cheaper than ROBOUTE, while Kane doesn't buff his army nearly as well. He can. One-shot Titans. If you put Gilman in a fight with Kane, you are losing 300 points. You need to balance out a risk and reward with the Primarch, because while he's tough, he isn't invincible. And it'll be real damn embarrassing if your ultimate victory plan turns to smoke, because Gilman tried to charge across the field and a pair of Chaos Knights unsupported. He's incredibly strong, but you shouldn't use him as a beat stick. He's a general who can hold his own, but at the end of the day, that's probably your best bet for using him as a general who can hold his own, not as the end-all be-all combat monster. And that just about wraps up my talk and everyone's favorite Grandpa Smurf. I hope you will embrace Gilman's superiority alongside me, now or at least look at him in a bit of a different light, and that's it. You've survived yet another video of mine. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to drop a like, subscribe, and leave a comment to let me know what you think, or just rant about some filthy Xenos. That works too. Thank you of course to my channel members. You are the theoretical practical mean to my ROBOUTE. Gilman, theoretically you think my content is worth something, and practically, you give me money to help me keep making content. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. Yeah, I know it's an overplayed meme. I don't care, Eldor Wife now. Canon. Suck my nuts. Give me more space. Elf smut.